We live in an age of convenience. These days, you don't have to step out the comfort of your own home to purchase any number of things, be it appliances, furniture, or even groceries. Video games are no exception, and even as someone that largely prefers physical copies of games, there's no denying how easy it is to buy and download a game in the modern age. One thing unique to gaming that came along with this is the advent of downloadable content. It's been around in the PC space for as long as that's been a thing, thanks to the nature of that platform, but it took a bit for dedicated video game platforms to adopt the model. Gone are the days of having to buy a fighting game, then getting the updated version of it separately, then getting the update to that update. You can just download full expansions or even content in a piecemeal fashion these days. The Season Pass model in particular seems to be the modern standard for this type of content distribution in the genre at this point, but have you ever wondered who might have waded into these waters first? Today, we'll be taking a look at a handful of fighting games from across notable fighting game developers and look at who the first DLC characters they released are. Seems like a silly topic, sure, but I think there's some interesting discussion that can be had there, since fighting game devs were still figuring things out in those regards. Were their initial DLC characters overtuned? Were they only available in suboptimal versions of a game? Stuff like that. For this video, we'll be working backwards a bit, starting in early 2012, late 2011, and seeing how far back we can go, including finding out who the first actual documented fighting game DLC character might have been. Some of the groups of characters we'll be talking about were released over the span of a few months, so in regards to those characters, we'll be primarily focusing on whichever character released first in those batches, though we'll talk a bit about some of them if they're relevant to the overall conversation. So, with all that sorted, let's get started. The King of Fighters 13 is a fighting game known for its outstanding visuals and having one of the greatest recorded sets in EVO history, but it was also notably SNK's first foray into the realm of character DLC. There were 5 characters that could be purchased from digital marketplaces over the course of 13's lifespan. The first 2 would be available about 2-ish weeks after the game's North American release, though they're not technically DLC characters. Psyche and Billy Khan were made available as an early unlocked DLC on digital platforms the week of December 6, 2011. Both characters can be unlocked without DLC though. Depending on how many target actions you do during arcade mode, Billy or Psyche will challenge you as a sub-boss halfway through the arcade ladder. Beat them, and you unlock them as a playable character. Since they're just an early unlock purchase for characters obtainable in the base roster for free in-game, they don't really count for this. A month later, Nestkyo and Mr. Karate were made available to purchase on January 20th, 2012. Nestkyo, as the name suggests, has Kyo appearing as designed from the NES Saga KOF games, spanning KOF 99 to 2001, with his moveset also reflecting his appearances in those games. Mr. Karate has Takuma, also already on the game's base roster, adopt his Mr. Karate persona, but specifically, borrowing a bit from his appearance as Serious Mr. Karate in SNK vs. Capcom as VC Chaos. It's basically Takuma if he decided to lock in. Before those two though, another character was made available on the same day as Billy and Psyche's early unlocks, Iori with the Power of Flames, who could be purchased for $4.99 on PS3 and 400 Microsoft points on 360. For the uninitiated, in the previous canon King of Fighters game, King of Fighters 11, Arc protagonist Ash Crimson manages to swipe the Yasakani Jewel, one of the series' 3 sacred treasures, from Iori, cutting off access to his flame powers and effectively depowering him. This ends up being reflected in Iori's moveset in 13, where he now has a tweaked fighting style that more emphasizes physical slashes in lieu of his flames, generally referred to these days within the fanbase as Chlor-Iori. As it turns out, Ash's shady action throughout KOF 2003, 11, and 13 were part of one long calculated gambit on his part, a gambit that, despite some last-minute speed bumps, ends up working out, though at the cost of Ash's own existence. Don't worry, he's back after KOF 14's event resurrected dead characters. In doing this though, Iori was able to reclaim his flames, and in the following games goes back to his traditional moveset. But considering Iori, being such an iconic character with an equally iconic moveset, is changed as much as he is in 13, it makes sense that SNK would offer an alternative for his classic moveset. Flames Iori is pretty much Iori as you've come to know and love him up to this point, even trading in his at the time modern design for his classic outfit. So, how did Iori and the other DLC characters in 13 end up faring overall? They weren't just decent, they were pretty damn great. Nestkyo admittedly isn't quite as cracked as the other 2. He's still absolutely one of the best characters in the game, but depending on combo routing, even base Kyo can keep up damage-wise. Mr. Karate and Flames Iori though, totally different story. Flames Iori and Mr. Karate in particular benefit from being able to be slotted in virtually any team position and thrive. Want to cash out with a crazy HD combo with Flames Iori, or stick him on point to secure an early lead with his stupidly hard but stupidly effective infinite? Sure, go for it. Generally speaking, characters in KOF usually end up thriving in specific team positions, depending on the game and of course, the player. Watch or play enough high-level KOF 15, and you'll notice characters like Ryo usually end up being put in anchor position because he hits hard, and with full resources, is incredibly scary to be touched by. With Mr. Karate and Iori though, they're versatile enough that nearly every team at a high level was playing one, if not both of them on their teams in pretty much every position. This team of DLC characters got so much play within competitive 13 that they came to be known as Team $15, the combined asking price of all three characters. Hold Back to Block has a great video that goes into more detail on this that I'd absolutely recommend. So, are these characters available today? As it turns out, yeah. All three characters are still on the PS3 store, and they can all still be purchased on the Microsoft Store and Xbox Series platforms since KOF 13 is backwards compatible there. That said, if you're playing 13, you probably want to be playing the recent Global Match re-release, which includes all three characters on the base roster. You still have to unlock Psyche and Billy though. That's pretty neat, and a stark contrast to some of the other examples in this video, where you're kind of out of luck if you want to buy them. Mortal Kombat 9 marked the long-running series' return to form under the then newly formed Netherrealm Studios, now under Warner Bros. Games after Midway went under in 2009. Its return to a faster-paced, strictly 2D plane fighting experience, combined with a cinematic story mode that sees a return to the events of the first three Mortal Kombat games, while also being a follow-up to Armageddon, and the truckload of content available in the game makes it a phenomenal package overall, and a fan favorite. Originally releasing in 2011, it was just in time to start taking advantage of the current trends in gaming, eventually adding 4 additional characters to the roster. Guest character Freddy Krueger in August of 2011, Rain and Kenshi in July, and most relevantly, their first DLC character, Scarlet, in June of 2011, for $4.99 on PS3 and 400 Microsoft points on Xbox. Scarlet is another in a long line of Mortal Kombat characters whose origins come from shady rumors that started back in the series' heyday, specifically rumors of a red-colored katana that you could get to show up under certain circumstances, much like similar rumors for Ermac in the first game. However, despite being a DLC character, Scarlet was actually teased right under players' noses in the lead-up to Mortal Kombat 9's release. In September of 2010, GameSpot held a Greatest Villain of All Time contest, allowing users to vote for who they considered the greatest video game villain of all time. Naturally, Shao Kahn was a candidate, at one point going up against General Rom from Gears of War, a character who would, funnily enough, find his way to fighting games a few years later. Shao Kahn had been trailing in votes, so Ed Boon took to Twitter to add some additional incentive, saying he'd reveal something cool about the then upcoming MK9 if Kahn managed to pull out the win. Not long after, he posted a small teaser to encourage more votes. Kahn ended up losing anyway, but the picture did set off some speculation as to who it could be, with some people actually guessing Shiva. Credit where credit's due though, some people did correctly call that NRS could possibly be pulling an Ermac and making the long-rumored Scarlet a reality. Not only did that turn out to be true, but Scarlet herself actually has a cameo in the story mode early on, though it's easy to miss. After original Timeline Raiden sends the "He must win" message to reboot Timeline Raiden, you can see everyone gathering for the MK tournament depicted in the first game. Look closely in the background during these scenes, and you'll see a red-clad woman among the potential combatants. Sneaky. As for Scarlet herself, her origin actually kinda depends on what game you're playing, since her appearance in Mortal Kombat 11 actually retcons her backstory. In 9, she was said to be a being created through a combination of Shao Kahn's magic and the blood of fallen warriors, created to spy on Quan Chi for Khan. In 11, she's instead an orphan taken in by Khan, who teaches her blood magic instead. This focus on blood extends to her gameplay design as well, having a unique blood projectile that self-damages but does really good chip, and the command dash in particular that leaves behind trails of blood. The aforementioned chip damage in general ended up being part of Scarlet's overall game plan, since she had strings that could essentially jail her opponent, leaving them unable to do anything but block and take the chip. This would also end up building a ton of meter for her, something she kind of needed since her wake-up options outside of her enhanced dash were pretty bad. She notably also got patched not too long after her release, since her slide was initially able to be cancelled in ways that were apparently unintended, that allowed for some scary mix-ups. So, are Scarlet and the other DLC characters available today? Yes and no. The DLC characters were eventually delisted, along with the game's network capabilities in general being disabled, at least on console. At least a part of this can probably be blamed on Freddy Krueger specifically, since the rights for him expired. You're not completely out of luck though. Mortal Kombat Complete Edition's physical release has all of the DLC characters on disc, even Freddy. There's no compatibility packs that can be downloaded, but that's also moot since the online is shut down anyway. This is also true for the Vita version of MK9 as well, though that version of the game has a pretty decent chunk of content exclusive to it, not the least of which are extra outfits for Scarlet that give her classic MK2 and MK3 styled outfits in the vein of the other female ninjas, finally bringing that old rumor full circle. She also has an additional extra costume that kind of feels like it might have been part of the inspiration for her MK11 redesign. That said though, while Scarlet is indeed the first DLC character for Mortal Kombat, that actually could have gone another way if things a few years earlier had gone according to plan. Remember how I mentioned Midway shut down in 2009? Well, that ended up derailing DLC plans for another Mortal Kombat game, Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. Specifically, Ed Boon had confirmed that the game was supposed to have gotten 2 DLC characters, Harley Quinn on the DC side and Quan Chi on the Mortal Kombat side, even posting a new render of the latter in his tweet. The former would end up in both Injustice games and the latter in MK9, and interestingly enough, his model in MK9 seems to be close to, if not near identical to the model used for that render. Once Capcom realized they could charge people for additional post-launch content in games, they dove in headfirst. Street Fighter 4 had a ton of costume DLC, but because the game itself hadn't been programmed with large-scale DLC expansions in mind, the eventual Super Street Fighter 4 had to be a new purchase altogether. Their next big fighting game at the time, Marvel vs. Capcom 3, did end up getting 2 DLC characters however, and 2 series veterans at that, Shuma Gorath from Marvel and Jill Valentine from the Resident Evil series. Shuma in particular has something of a well-documented story behind this inclusion. According to the game's producer Ryota Nitsuma, the development team at Aiding and Capcom really wanted Shuma in the game, and was one of the earliest proposed characters. Marvel flat out rejected this initial proposal, but the devs continued to plead their case until Marvel eventually relented, but with one specific stipulation, that he not be a base roster character, but instead DLC. While it, to my knowledge, hasn't officially been said why Jill was added to the roster, I imagine the DLC stipulation from Marvel meant having the unexpectedly designed an additional Capcom character as DLC to keep roster parity. And in that sense, Jill's a logical addition. Like Shuma, she's a returning character, having appeared in fan favorite Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and her moveset in 3 is redone from the ground up to reflect her appearance in Resident Evil 5, which was at the time Capcom's highest selling game of all time. Both characters were announced a few months ahead of the game's early 2011 release, being announced alongside and included within the game's collector's edition as well. About a month or so after the game's release, both the characters would be made available to download, though data exists for them on the disc for the game's initial release that was found through data mining. Jill in particular has most of her art assets available, but is missing the vast majority of her voice work. The additional data to fully complete these characters being added in a patch ahead of both characters' March 15, 2011 release date. So how did they end up faring overall? Well, they didn't end up making much of an impact in the game's competitive space. Jill in particular was hyped up as being secretly broken by Capcom testers and staff that worked on the game's official strategy guide, but nothing really ever came of it. She's certainly not bad, but being one of the most demanding characters in the game from an execution standpoint, on top of being paid DLC, and it not being broken in any obvious manner, probably contributed to her muted overall reception. Shuma fared slightly better in that Mystic Ray is a phenomenal assist, but struggles mid-screen and on point as well, outside of some very specific setups. There are people that manage to make him work competitively though, most notably Angelic, getting 3rd place finishes at 2 separate EVOs with his Wolverine, Dormammu, and Shuma Gorath team. Both characters were also available for the game's re-release, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 on PS3 and 360, though having them purchased for the vanilla version gave you access to them in Ultimate. PS3 buyers also got an additional perk. If you owned the Vita port of the game, all of the DLC was cross-buy, so buying them on PS3 also gave you access to them on Vita. In fact, the store listing even changed to only reflect the Vita version on the storefront, though the DLC itself could still be downloaded to PS3. So, can these characters still be purchased today? No, but it's not all bad. All of Marvel 3's DLC would be pulled from storefronts when Capcom's Marvel license eventually ran out, meaning that for a few years, the only way to play these characters were on Xbox and PlayStation accounts that had already purchased them. However, the game got a surprise port to PS4 in 2016, with PC and Xbox One ports following in early 2017. This new release of the game bundled nearly all of the costume DLC in the game, as well as Shuma Gorath and Jill, and is still available to purchase today. This version also got a physical release on PS4 and Xbox, so both characters are pretty neatly preserved, thankfully. So, that wraps up Capcom's first two fighting game DLC characters. At least, the first one on traditional gaming platforms. Because as it turns out, Jill and Shuma are technically the second instance of a downloadable character in a Capcom fighting game. The first instance is a game most people wouldn't think of first. So, I mentioned Street Fighter 4 earlier and how its initial release wasn't built to be able to support DLC beyond cosmetics, right? Well, at the time, there was one other version of Street Fighter 4 that was able to get downloadable content updates. Meet Street Fighter 4 Mobile. This was a version of Street Fighter 4 built from the ground up for mobile phones, particularly the iPhone. It supports virtual touch controls, though it get proper gamepad support down the line, and has standard modes like arcade and survival mode, as well as netplay. The controls understandably had to be dumbed down, but if you know your Street Fighter 4, you can surprisingly manage pretty well. Even FADCs are possible. Released roughly a year after the initial release of the console ports in 2009, the game originally launched with 8 characters: Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Blanca, Abel, Guile, Dhalsim, and Bison. A couple months later, however, just ahead of E3 2010, Capcom revealed that the iOS version of the game would be receiving a free update that would add 2 additional characters, Cammy and Zangief. Both characters were available with the game's free update on June 23, 2010, a solid 8.5 months before Jill and Shuma in Marvel 3, effectively making them the first Capcom DLC characters in a fighting game. Kind of an asterisk, but yeah. The mobile version would surprisingly continue to be updated throughout the 2010s, getting a separate title update, Street Fighter 4 Volt, which added more characters, and the most recent version, Street Fighter 4 Champion Edition, which frankly has a pretty decent roster. By the time Street Fighter 4 Volt released in 2011 though, the game already had a really good port for traditional handhelds in the form of the 3DS version, but it's kind of funny to see how the mobile version still kind of outlived it. Speaking of handhelds, that's actually something that crossed my mind when working on this video. Who was the first DLC character in a fighting game on a traditional gaming handheld? When I think of fighting games on portables with downloadable characters, a few games immediately come to mind. Smash 3DS, PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale on Vita, and hell, we've already talked about Marvel 3 on Vita. I was starting to think Marvel 3 on Vita might have been the answer to this question too, as far as traditional handhelds were concerned, but I ended up mentioning this video idea to a friend one day, and they casually mentioned that they knew of a PSP game with honest-to-god character DLC. It's a licensed game from a series I admittedly have only a little experience with, so everything in this section was more or less dictated to me by said friend. Just wanted to make that clear in advance. It is from a developer I'm familiar with though. As it turns out, while Marvel 3 isn't the first handheld fighting game with DLC characters, I was kind of on the right track, because the game that does have that honor is in fact developed by Aiding. Marvel 3 is easily Aiding's most high profile and probably highest budget fighting game release. But if you've been in these fighting game trenches for a minute, you'll know that Aiding's been around the block for a while. They were the original developers of the Bloody Roar series and have worked on a ton of licensed fighting games, running the gamut of Naruto, Fate Unlimited Codes, Kamen Rider, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, Castlevania, Zatch Bell, and most recently Nen Impact, among others. Some of those games like Fate Unlimited Codes and the Kamen Rider fighters wound up with PSP ports as well, but PSP was also the exclusive home of the Bleach Heat the Soul series of fighting games, also developed by Aiding. These are 3D fighting games that don't quite play like anything else. They have a simplified control scheme, and while it's easy to see people with swords in a 3D fighter and think Soul Calibur, I'd say that's actually doing this game and its mechanics a disservice. You've got air dashes, just defends, counterattacks that can be done out of said just defends. It's honestly pretty wild. Even more wild is just how many of these games there are. This was largely an annual series, releasing at minimum one entry every year starting in 2005, albeit only in Japan. The final game in the series, Heat the Soul 7, released in September of 2010. A few months later, just before the end of the year, the fourth Bleach movie, Hellverse, would release in Japan, and Heat the Soul 7 wound up getting a free DLC expansion of sorts to coincide with this. First and foremost, with the DLC, the movie's main antagonist Shuren was made a playable character. There's also additional EX missions for Aizen available, as well as additional customizable system voices. What's most interesting about all this, however, is how this is implemented. To play this, you had to download the update from the PlayStation Store and then update it manually via the PSP XMB while the UMD was in your PSP. If you did it right, you'd get a new screen upon boot giving you two options. The first is the base game as you know it, with the additional missions and system voices. The second is a separate instance of the game altogether. It takes the movie's name as its subtitle and changes the title screen to reflect it, with Shuren front and center. This is the mode he's playable in, but there's a catch. This version of the game can only be played in local multiplayer against the computer or another person with the game. Upon choosing this option, you're actually met with a warning screen, telling you which options are unavailable before you go to the title screen. I'd have to assume technical limitations were at play here, but it's really interesting seeing what had to be done to get some actual non-cosmetic DLC working on PSP. It's kind of fascinating. So, can you still get this DLC today? Surprisingly, yes, but boy do you have to jump through some hoops to access it if you don't already own it. It's still available in the PS3 store and is still free, so you can download it to your PS3. Unfortunately, because of the mandatory two-factor authentication update Sony made to PS3 not too long ago, you can't locally transfer content from PS3 to PSP anymore. Then there's the PSP store, which requires you to basically be using an open Wi-Fi connection since the WEP security PSP utilized is an obsolete standard now. You also can't buy any new games on it, you can only re-download what's in your library. If you're playing this via emulation, there's various ways to obtain this DLC instead, and considering the DLC itself was free, it's not even all that shady. Still though, this was an interesting little rabbit hole to go down, even from just a technical perspective. The late 2000s and early 2010s were an interesting time if you were an Arc System Works fan. Because of rights issues, the Guilty Gear series was kind of on ice, at least it's a fighting game series, and you saw Arc experimenting with new games like Battle Fantasia. But something had to fill the unique hole Guilty Gear left behind both aesthetically and mechanically, and BlazBlue was what ended up answering the call. Look, full disclosure here, I'm terrible at BlazBlue. Always have been. But these games undoubtedly have some of the most creatively designed characters I've ever seen in a fighting game from a mechanical standpoint. The way the drive system interacts with each character and their overall kit design are genuinely some of the coolest concepts in the genre. A grappler whose entire game plan centers around magnetizing his opponent so that they can be brought within range of his command grabs? I don't even like grapplers, but that's cool as hell. The series dropped in arcades and then consoles with its inaugural game, Calamity Trigger, but it's the sequel, Continuum Shift, that we'll be focusing on today. After Continuum Shift was ported to consoles in 2010, it received 3 DLC characters over the course of its lifespan. Platinum the Trinity in May of 2011, Valkenhayn, one of Rachel's butlers, in September of 2010, and most relevantly, Makoto in August of 2010, for $7.99 on PS3 and 560 Microsoft points on 360. Makoto is commonly cited as the first instance of a downloadable character in a fighting game on consoles that wasn't some form of dislocked content with a price tag greedily tacked on. I'll talk about why I'm making that specific distinction a little later. That said, Makoto herself did exist in the lore of the series prior to Continuum Shift though. She appears as a non-playable character in Calamity Trigger, being a friend of Noelle, who she also has unique in-fight dialogue with in Continuum Shift. Makoto is a hand-to-hand fighter that wields a pair of tonfas and has a fighting style augmented by her extraordinary reflexes, due in part to her part squirrel heritage. Her drive in BlazBlue is Impact, which allows her to charge her moves for more damage and additional benefits like wall bounces and such. There's a bit more involved with it though. She can actually charge these up to 3 levels depending on how long you hold the drive button. For example, she has a stationary projectile that when done at close range can hit multiple times or set up some oki on a knocked down opponent. However, she has a drive attack that can also send this projectile forward, and the level you charge it to determines its range and grants it additional effects. She also has a parry that has a counter attack that can be input and charged with drive, and charging to a higher level does additional damage and stuns the opponent for longer. These also apply to Makoto's distortion drives and astral heat, again being able to be charged up to level 3. Note that each move we've talked about has different charge timing, so the trick is remembering how long to hold drive for each move for optimal damage and positioning. It should be noted though that Makoto doesn't have any in-game arcade story content as a DLC character in Continuum Shift 1. She's playable in most other modes though. So how did Makoto end up overall? Well, she didn't have much of a presence in competitive Continuum Shift early on due to being a console-only DLC character, since the arcade version of the game was the competitive standard at the time. She and the other console DLC characters would be added to the arcade version of the game's title update, Continuum Shift 2, where she got some pretty insane buffs that made her a pain to contend with. The following update, Continuum Shift Extend, would tone her down quite a bit, making her more manageable overall. So, can you still get Makoto these days? That's kind of a funny question with a few different answers. In Continuum Shift 1, she and the other DLC characters aren't available to buy on Xbox 360 anymore due to the 360 marketplace closing down. She, along with Platinum and Valkenhayn, can still be purchased on the PS3 store though, for however long that'll remain up. That said, if you're still playing BlazBlue to get better at it these days, you're probably playing Central Fiction. If you're a more casual player and want to experience the story of the series however, Continuum Shift Extend is actually the game you want. It has all the story of Continuum Shift as well as all of the DLC characters up to that point in time. There's largely no real reason to be playing a version of Continuum Shift outside of Extend these days unless you're really curious about the PSP and 3DS ports of CS2. Okay, so I mentioned that Makoto was the first DLC character on consoles that wasn't just dislocked content with a price tag. I made that very specific distinction because 2 years prior, one game did in fact pull this move off across 2 platforms. Where does a series like Soul Calibur go after somehow pulling off 3 console-exclusive guest characters across 3 separate platforms with Soul Calibur 2? You bring in one of the most recognizable pieces of media of all time, of course. I am admittedly not a Star Wars person. I don't mention that in a "ooh, look at me and how subversive my media tastes are from the norm" kind of way, but more so to emphasize that even I could recognize just how big of a deal it was to have Yoda and Darth Vader in a goddamn Soul Calibur game. Like with Soul Calibur 2 though, there was a familiar catch. Yoda was exclusive to the Xbox 360, while Vader was locked to the PS3. I don't know if both characters' primary colors being aligned with the console they were exclusive to was part of the marketing plan or just a happy coincidence, but it does fit perfectly. Not even a week into the game's late July release though, it was discovered that at least on Xbox 360, Vader was actually on the disc alongside Yoda, even showing video proof of a Yoda vs Vader match on the platform. A video that was immediately struck down by Bandai Namco, further proving its validity. This was made even worse by an interview from that same time frame with the game's director Katsutoshi Sasaki, where when asked if there was a possibility that the console-exclusive characters could show up on the opposite platforms, he gave a generic "no plans as of now" response. But as we'd soon come to learn multiple times over the years when it comes to post-launch purchases, that train's never late. And in October of the same year, Bandai Namco announced that they'd be allowing players to purchase the missing Star Wars character on their respective platforms for $5 on PS3 and 400 Microsoft points on 360. So, how did they fare competitively? Well, that's kind of a tricky question. I see it commonly stated that Yoda was banned specifically for his size, making him difficult to fight against, but thanks to a thread on 8-Way Run chronicling the series' history of banned characters, we can actually see the reason was a lot more practical. Simply put, being console exclusive meant banning both Vader and Yoda from competitive play on release, which makes sense. How do you reasonably learn counterplay for a character that's not even in the version of the game you brought? It understandably presents some logistical issues. However, both characters were in fact unbanned when they were made available on both platforms. Unbanned everywhere except for tournaments ran in France apparently? I don't know. In the mid-2010s, Soul Calibur 4's DLC, along with the game itself, was delisted from digital storefronts. The Star Wars license expiring, along with Disney's purchase of Lucasfilms in the early 2010s, is generally cited as the most probable reason for this. Both characters can still be played on their respective platforms, but if you didn't already buy them, you're out of luck. This is especially egregious in this game's case, because there will always be an empty space on the character select screen where the character should be if you had bought the DLC. Almost like the game's taunting you for not paying up earlier. I imagine this is less of an issue for homebrewed consoles on either platform, but yeah. So, with that sorted, we finally come down to our last character. The original draft of this video was going to end here, but the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to make sure I did a thorough enough dive into this subject before finalizing the video. Online content downloads on home consoles only go back but so far, so I decided I'd check the PC space, just in case. Maybe there's some obscure fighting game out there that might have been ahead of the curve that I was unaware of. Now, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm some doujin fighter connoisseur. Outside of some that ended up gaining some traction outside of their home country, there's still something I've really only started scratching the surface of recently. One such game was brought to my attention by Q Manchu, who did a phenomenal video a while back on status effects in fighting games, and one game in particular featured in it caught my eye. Touhou Hiso Tensoku. Soku's a fighting game spin-off of the Touhou series, itself a series of doujin shoot-em-ups. The doujin shoot-em-up series, really. Being based on a shoot-em-up, there's a larger emphasis placed on mobility and projectiles than in your average fighting game. I figured, okay, that's a game I've heard of. I'll start from there and see where I end up afterwards. Well, I actually didn't have to look very far. You see, Hiso Tensoku is actually the third Touhou fighting game, itself an expansion of sorts to Scarlet Weather Rhapsody, which follows up from the first of the fighting game spin-offs and the one we'll be talking about, Touhou 7.5, Immaterial and Missing Power. By the way, the 7.5 in the title denotes that it takes place between the 7th and 8th Touhou games, Perfect Cherry Blossom and Imperishable Night respectively. Immaterial and Missing Power's calling card is its spell card system, adopted from the main Touhou games. Basically, they dictate the bullet patterns of bosses in the series, and Immaterial and Missing Power implements them as super moves. This is most noticeable when playing the game's story mode, as opponents will use more and more spell cards the further in the game you get, making fighting through those final phases pretty stressful, fittingly akin to a bullet hell shooter. After various trial versions and demos released throughout 2004, the 1.0 version of the game was released on December 30th, 2004 at Comiket 67, Comiket itself being a long-running volunteer-run convention for doujin works. Over the course of 2005, the game would receive several downloadable patches, fixing bugs and making general tweaks. The game's final patch, version 1.11, would be made available to download on July 8th, 2005. And whether the developer knew it or not, they also made history that day, because along with the usual bug fixes and balance tweaks, 1.11 came with something interesting. An entirely new playable character. The first fighting game DLC character. Meet Hong Mei Ling, or Hon Mei Rin if you're using the Japanese pronunciation. She's also called China in some circles, stemming from a debate on what her name actually was in her early appearances, thanks to some slightly illegible kanji. She debuted in the Touhou series proper in the 6th game, the embodiment of Scarlet Devil, appearing as the Stage 3 boss of that game. She uses Chinese martial arts, and her moveset in Immaterial and Missing Power showcases this, including some moves that might look a little familiar to eagle-eyed fighting game lovers. That said, she's actually considered to be a fairly weak character overall in Immaterial and Missing Power, since her projectiles and her general melee attacks aren't particularly great, which is a problem, because the former is a tool to force mistakes, and the latter is supposed to help capitalize off of them. She doesn't have a story scenario, but is playable in every other mode though. She's actually absent from the game's sequel, Scarlet Weather Rhapsody, but does return in Hiso Tensoku. This is not at all where I envision this video ending up, but honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way, and hey, even I learned something new. Thanks for watching this far, and feel free to support me on Patreon if you're so inclined. Might actually pick up Soku now, since I'm really interested in seeing how its weather system affects the dynamics of a match. As always, shoutouts to the patrons that support the channel, as well as the folks I consulted to fact check some of the stuff in this video. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.